Thank you. Thank you. And I know that we are all tired, but all very excited by the fantastic presentations we have heard so far. So we still have one topic to cover, environmental procedural justice, or the procedural dimension of environmental justice. And it's a topic that, as we have begun to discuss in the previous sessions to some extent, so we'll dig into it more deeply. So the idea is to discuss how to facilitate access to information, how to facilitate participation in decision-making and legal recourse. So we would like to discuss the barriers to engagement in environmental policy and decision-making that exist today in our respective countries. We'd like to discuss how countries have improved meaningful engagement in practice. So what are the lessons learned? And lastly, what constitutes meaningful engagement from the perspective of communities. We have 3 speakers. We have 1 hour. So I would like to introduce first the speakers and then give them the floor. First, Emily Barrett, senior lecturer in environmental law at King's College in London and visiting professor at the École de Droit of Sciences Po in Paris. Then Gloria Amparo Rodriguez, magistrate at the Special Jurisdiction for Peace in Colombia. And Anaï Ranin, member of the OECD Youth-Wide, the OECD's Youth Advisory Board, consisting of members age maximum 30. And she's from New Zealand. So first, I would like to give the floor to Emily Barrett. Could you unpack for us what procedural environmental justice means and why does it matter? And how can these procedural issues be operationalized through environmental law? And what are the challenges to promoting procedural environmental justice? Please, Emily, you have the floor for 10 maybe minutes. Yes. Just push the button.
Good afternoon, everybody. And I realize that we are the panel that is standing between you and your drink in the garden. So I thank you in advance for your attention as we come to the question of procedural environmental justice. And I am going to be talking about something called the Aarhus Convention, which is a treaty that covers the European or the pan-European region. And I'm going to answer, I think, 3 questions that are slightly different to the questions that have been posed. These are my questions. What does Aarhus do? What makes it special? I find it very special. I hope to share with you why. And what does it tell us about achieving environmental justice now? And I have a spoiler alert, because I think one of the more pressing environmental justice challenges that we're facing is the treatment of environmental defenders. And so I'm going to speak a little bit about how the Aarhus Convention addresses environmental defenders. So to my first question, what does the Aarhus Convention do? Well, it is the first international environmental agreement that marries the question of our fundamental rights and environmental protection. So we go back to Professor Wilson's point in his presentation that environmental justice is all about the protection of human rights. And Aarhus recognizes this intimate connection between environmental quality and our fundamental rights. In fact, the convention opens with its purpose, which states that it is to contribute to the right of every person of present and future, I emphasize this, generations to live in an environment adequate to his or her health and well-being. Now, this was a surprisingly radical statement, both for the time and for the region, but it is the statement that drives and motivates the convention. And in order to achieve this aim, the Aarhus Convention guarantees 3 procedural rights, and you can see the rights on a screen near you. And they're often referred to as the 3 pillars of the convention, which is why we have these lovely Roman pillars, or someone will tell me they're Greek pillars, in fact, on the slide. And so the first of the pillars is access to environmental information. This involves both a passive requirement to respond to requests for environmental information, but it also involves an active requirement to be gathering, collecting, and disseminating environmental information so that it is readily available, this question about data. The second procedural right is the right to public participation in environmental decision-making. And the convention covers a whole spectrum of environmental decisions. So this is kind of the more local, low-level planning decisions. You're objecting to a new development in your local area, that Aarhus covers that, but also higher-level policy decisions and even legally binding normative instruments. Kind of the convention is less expansive in relation to these types of decision-making, but it is intended to cover all types of environmental decisions. And then the third pillar of the Aarhus Convention is the pillar of access to justice. The pillar on access to justice is designed to cover both instances where the rights contained within the convention have not been upheld. So if you have not had appropriate access to environmental information, the convention kind of entitles you and gives you the right to then seek that access by judicial means. And then also access to justice in relation to omissions and acts, both of public and private bodies that breach or contravene provisions of domestic environmental law. And this kind of provision is designed to cover both kind of the questions of legal access, so whether you are entitled to go to court, and also questions of financial access, whether you can even afford to go to court in the first place. And in a jurisdiction like the UK, where I'm from, this question of being able to afford access to courts is kind of a fundamental importance and one that is still being grappled with. So underlying these three pillars is an ambitious and potentially very powerful vision and I realize I don't have the clicker. Sorry, thank you. Thank you. A very powerful vision of equipping citizens to actively steward their environment. And at the time of signing the Aarhus Convention, the then Secretary General Kofi Annan said this, that the Aarhus Convention is the most ambitious venture in environmental democracy undertaken under the auspices of the United Nations. And here I will say that I think environmental democracy is deeply embedded or intertwined with concepts of environmental justice. Now, a very cynical take on what the Aarhus Convention was doing at the time was to say that Aarhus was not really about environmental democracy, but it was about giving democratic architecture to former Soviet states who were starting to build their own independent democracies. But that's a very limited vision of what Aarhus is doing. And in fact, it goes far beyond that and sets very high standards of environmental democracy for all of the parties. And I think it does this in a way that perhaps the parties had not necessarily anticipated. And we'll come to that in a moment. So what is it about Aarhus that makes it so special? Well, in addition to its very visionary melding together of human rights and environmental protection, and also this ambitious commitment to environmental democracy, there are two further tricks up the sleeve of the Aarhus Convention that I think make it quite special. Now, the first is contained in Article 15 of the Convention, and this is its compliance committee. It's fairly unusual compliance committee in kind of the field of international environmental law. And it's a non-confrontational and non-judicial body that keeps compliance of the convention under constant review. And the thing that makes the compliance committee so special is that it is open to anybody who wishes to make a complaint about non-compliance. And the former special rapporteur on the right to a healthy environment, John Knox, described the nature of access to the compliance committee as being both horizontal and diagonal. And by diagonal, he means that you could make a complaint about a country that you don't live in, that you have no connection to, if you're simply concerned about ensuring compliance. So a French NGO who thinks that there ought to be better access to information on environmental quality, and the UK is not giving that access to environmental quality information, could make a complaint to the Aarhus Compliance Committee, and they wouldn't say, no, thank you, go away. We're not talking about your country. So that we have this open access to the Compliance Committee, which of course is foundational to ensuring open access to justice. The second thing that makes the Aarhus Convention quite special is its Article 10. And in Article 10 of the Convention, it requires the parties to keep the provisions and implementation of the Convention under constant review. This means, and this is intended to kind of ensure that the purposes and the vision of the Convention are meaningfully and fully realized. And it confirms that the Aarhus Convention is not just kind of now an ancient piece of international environmental law from over 20 years ago. It is a living and breathing response to questions of environmental justice. And so in my, I don't know how to operate this. And so in my final answering my final question, what does the Aarhus Convention tell us about environmental justice now? I want to give you a very clear example of why the Aarhus Convention is such a responsive and attentive instrument of environmental law, and thus why it is so deeply committed to environmental justice. And that is the way in which the Aarhus Convention has responded to the treatment of environmental defenders. This is, of course, a global issue. As work by the NGO Global Witness has shown, as well as the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, the situation for environmental defenders globally is very serious. And between 2012 and 2020, 1,539 deaths of environmental defenders have been recorded. But critically, for parties of the Aarhus Convention, it is also a serious issue in the European region, and most especially in relation to environmental defenders who are trying to raise awareness and political engagement on the question of climate damage. Now here we see Article 3 of the Aarhus Convention, which is intended to cover the kind of protection for environmental defenders. And it says that they should be free, that they should not be penalized, persecuted, or harassed in any way for their involvement in aspects of the convention. And now, whilst this was originally conceived for procedural environmental rights that I've already spoken about, the Aarhus Compliance Committee have said that this provision of the convention also covers those engaging in peaceful protest. And this, of course, is important for the European region because those environmental defenders engaging in these activities of peaceful protest, have experienced things like threats to their livelihood, intimidation, criminalization, and violence. To give you two examples, one from here in France, activists who had been objecting to Total's activities in Uganda found themselves facing airport detentions and house searches. And in an even more serious situation in Romania, two forest rangers who had been trying to resist illegal logging activities were killed. So the question of the security and safety of environmental defenders is not just a distant question, it is a very real and present issue for the parties of the convention to deal with. And concerned about the threats to environmental defenders in 2021, kind of based on Article 3.8 of the Convention, the parties enacted this decision 7.9, establishing a rapid response mechanism for the protection of environmental defenders. And as part of this decision, they implemented, or they created the Office of the Special Rapporteur for Environmental Defenders, currently held by Michel Faust. As with the Compliance Committee, the Special Rapporteur for Environmental Defenders is open to anybody who wishes to make a complaint, who is facing an urgent threat. And what is kind of critical and important about this post is that he will respond immediately to any kind of complaint. There is no requirement, as with other mechanisms, to exhaust domestic remedies. You don't have to wait to kind of finish a trial in your home jurisdiction to make your complaint for Michel Faust to respond to. And he has a number of powers in relation to the post. He can make public statements, he can issue protection measures, he can exert diplomatic pressure, and he can also make referrals to other human rights bodies. There's also a second part of his office that he's taken very seriously, and that is to do a kind of proactive research assessing the situation and the treatment of environmental defenders. And indeed, in February of this year, he released his first kind of position paper on state repression of environmental protest and civil disobedience within the European region. And he describes, and I'll just kind of read the highlighted bits, he makes the point that the treatment of environmental defenders is a major threat to democracy and human rights, and that the only legitimate response to these kind of peaceful environmental activism and civil disobedience is to respect it. And the treatment that environmental defenders have faced is unacceptable. So I realize that some of you may be listening to what I've just said and think that, well, public protest, civil disobedience, this is very far from those three procedural rights engaging in formal processes that the Aarhus Convention was originally intended to protect. Protesting a development is quite different from turning up to the planning appeal and making an objection. And so in closing, I want to leave you with two thoughts as to why I think the gap between those two kind of visions of Aarhus is not so wide. The first is kind of a question around the nature of formal forms of public participation.
Sorry, Emily, could you wrap up quickly? Okay, thanks.
Sorry. The first is that formal participation is often kind of exclusionary. It's complex to digest this kind of environmental information, and you need to have the financial capital available to you to engage in legal processes. As Professor Schlossberg said at the beginning, there are institutional obstacles, there are non-inclusion policy procedures that make this kind of participatory procedural justice difficult. And of course, it's exacerbated because if you are good at accessing these processes, if you are highly educated, if you're rich, all of these things are more available to you. And so you exacerbate injustices. Of course, protest and civil disobedience is not perfectly accessible. There are questions around race that make it engaging this kind of activity more complex, but it's still kind of less of a barrier to the formal processes. And then the second thing, and that's my closing point, is that kind of at the heart of the convention is this commitment to environmental democracy, to environmental justice, to the protection of human rights. And if we take the kind of the vision of the Aarhus Convention seriously, then it needs to encompass the full gambit of political engagement. This, of course, includes the formal processes and rights that the Aarhus Convention facilitates, but it also includes protest and civil disobedience. These more disruptive forms of environmental democracy must be respected if the right of both present and, I emphasize again, future generations to live in an environment adequate to human health and well-being is to be respected.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thank you for bringing somehow a new topic again in the conversation, protection of environmental activists. Now I would like to give the floor to Gloria Amparo Rodriguez, and I would like to hear your perspective on the importance of meaningfully engaging people in decision-making, and what is your experience that you could share from Colombia, and what are the challenges in doing so? Please, Gloria, you have the floor. And sorry, yes, she will be speaking in Spanish, so you can use your headset to get the translation.
Okay. Muchísimas gracias. Estoy muy contenta de poder estar el día de hoy con ustedes hablando de un tema muy importante que tiene que ver con la justicia ambiental, sobre todo porque Colombia es un país que sufre muchísimo como consecuencia del conflicto y en especial de los conflictos ambientales. Quiero adicionalmente señalar que para el país, para nuestro país, el tema de la justicia ambiental ha tomado una relevancia muy especial y quiero mostrarlo con casos, porque creo que los casos pueden ser muy representativos alrededor de esto. A ver cómo se hace esto. Ok, miren ustedes, estamos hablando de un país rico en diversidad natural y en diversidad cultural, donde desafortunadamente muchos de los proyectos que han llegado a realizarse en territorios donde habitan comunidades de campesinos, comunidades de indígenas, pueblos afrodescendientes, tienen que sufrir cada día por la afectación de su territorio, por la contaminación, por la explotación de recursos naturales y por supuesto esto hace que el acceso a la información, el acceso a la participación y los recursos jurídicos se constituyen en un elemento muy importante para poder avanzar en la justicia ambiental. De esta manera quiero representar esto con algunas cifras muy importantes. La Corte Constitucional Colombiana, que es la que conoce de nuestros derechos fundamentales, es una alta corte, ha tenido que enfrentar durante los últimos años muchos litigios alrededor de los temas ambientales. En especial, porque se viola el derecho a la participación. Por ejemplo, como ustedes ven, la cifra de demandas por el acceso a el derecho de petición son enormes, más de 1.300.000 sentencias sobre eso demuestran cómo tenemos una gran dificultad, cómo tenemos la necesidad de poder avanzar en la garantía de estos derechos. Tenemos muchas demandas sobre temas de agua, sobre temas de participación ambiental, sobre el tema de el manejo y el uso de los recursos naturales, pero en especial hay algo muy importante a resaltar y es que en Colombia la Corte Constitucional, a quien no le correspondería, ha tenido que enfrentar demandas por el tema del acceso a la participación ambiental y al derecho a gozar de un ambiente sano. Temas que son necesarios abordar de manera puntual, lo cual significa que en Colombia se está promoviendo un litigio estratégico. Y ese litigio estratégico implica, entre otras cosas, el que las demandas estén incluyendo la solicitud a que se pueda acceder a la justicia en materia ambiental. El litigio estratégico está referido especialmente a la solución de problemas estructurales. Y esos problemas estructurales en nuestro país van enfocados especialmente a unas mejores condiciones de vida de las comunidades que se ven enfrentadas a grandes empresas, a grandes sectores que quieren hacer proyectos en sus territorios sin tener en cuenta su cultura, sin tener en cuenta su participación y sin tener en cuenta el ordenamiento territorial en nuestro territorio. De esa manera, entonces, para responder una pregunta que antes hacían, que las jóvenes que tienen recursos, si también están participando o no en estos procesos, pues quiero decirles que sí. En nuestro país, las comunidades se han aliado a través del litigio estratégico con universidades de alto nivel, con universidades donde acceden los jóvenes con mayores recursos económicos y de esa forma se han podido establecer mecanismos a través de los cuales organizaciones indígenas, ONGs, comunidades en general, ¿sí? Se unen con los grupos de acciones públicas de estas universidades para poder presentar acciones. Esto significa que el litigio estratégico en nuestro país está siendo liderado por las comunidades con el apoyo y a través del intercambio de saberes entre comunidades locales, la ciencia y por supuesto desde una mirada interdisciplinaria. Esto ha sido fundamental para la defensa de los derechos de estas colectividades. Adicionalmente, debo señalar algunos casos que son representativos alrededor de ello. Miren ustedes sobre el tema de la participación. La participación, que significa hacerse parte de algo y sobre todo hacerse parte en las decisiones que tienen que ver con asuntos ambientales, algo que aparece en nuestra Constitución política. Aquí encontramos un caso muy importante en nuestro país que hace referencia a algo donde se involucran comunidades, no solamente comunidades que son tradicionales como los pueblos indígenas, sino también donde se involucran campesinos e inclusive un grupo de golfistas que presentan una acción especial, una acción de amparo muy especial para defender el derecho a la participación, el derecho a la consulta previa y el derecho a poder tener un territorio donde se iba a hacer un relleno sanitario que por supuesto iba a afectar mucho a esta comunidad. Miren ustedes que esta sentencia de la Corte Constitucional, una sentencia muy importante, nos habla de la participación y tiene en cuenta que la participación tiene que hacerse desde la cuna a la tumba. En los procesos ambientales la participación debe ser un proceso continuo, no solamente cuando se proyectan hacer este tipo de construcciones, sino durante su ejecución, durante todo el proceso de desarrollo, durante todo el proceso de planificación. Por eso la participación se ha constituido en ese elemento fundamental para ellos, la participación como un elemento para la construcción de lo público, donde todos podamos incidir, pero adicionalmente donde todos podamos tener en cuenta que no se pueden conocer los proyectos simplemente cuando llega la maquinaria a los territorios, que la comunidad requiere desde antes tener un proceso para poder tener pertenencia de los proyectos, para poder saber que ese proyecto que se va a realizar sea el que efectivamente requiere la comunidad para poder lograr su desarrollo. En segundo lugar, debo señalar algo muy importante, y es que el tema de la consulta previa. La consulta previa en nuestro país está referido o fundamentado en el convenio 169 de la OIT. Y esta consulta previa aplica en Colombia para los pueblos indígenas, para las comunidades negras o afrodescendientes y para las comunidades rom o gitanas. Y miren ustedes, muchos de los litigios estratégicos en materia ambiental tienen que ver con el tema de consulta previa. Más de 700 sentencias de la Corte Constitucional avalando, ¿sí?, el derecho fundamental que tienen estas comunidades a que antes de tomar cualquier decisión administrativa o legislativa en sus territorios sean consultados. ¿Consultados para qué? Consultados para llegar a un acuerdo, lograr el consentimiento, consultados para saber cómo se ven afectados, para que puedan opinar y para que puedan también tomar medidas especiales alrededor de esto. Y eso lo ha señalado muy claramente el litigio estratégico que se ha dado en nuestro país alrededor de esta temática. Debo en segundo caso hablar de un tema muy especial de un área muy importante en Colombia, un área que inclusive es turística. Y aquí encontramos comunidades negras o afrodescendientes que han visto cómo se ven afectadas sus actividades tradicionales y sus actividades de turismo precisamente porque hay unos intereses alrededor de eso. Alguien hablaba hoy de poder, alguien hablaba hoy de los intereses de los grandes sectores, ¿sí?, en este caso sectores turísticos que querían sacar a las comunidades que ancestralmente han vivido en su territorio para poder llegar allí a hacer infraestructura hotelera y poder realizar ellos mismos esas actividades. Estas comunidades se unieron para poder defender sus territorios, para poder defender el derecho a la alimentación, para poder defender el derecho a poder vivir como colectividades en un territorio de la mayor belleza en nuestro país, donde muchos turistas van a visitar precisamente porque es un área con gran diversidad natural, donde se puede gozar de un mar espectacular, el mar de los 7 colores, donde adicionalmente a eso las comunidades ofrecen servicios alimentarios tradicionales de muy apetecidos por los turistas que llegan allí. Estas comunidades se unieron y a través de recursos legales lograron la defensa de su territorio y la defensa de sus recursos allí en estas zonas. Miren ustedes que esto no es fácil. Estamos hablando de temas de transporte, estamos hablando de temas alimenticios, estamos hablando de temas ambientales. Y en este contexto nosotros podemos ver la integralidad de los derechos. El derecho a la alimentación se une con el derecho a gozar de un ambiente sano, se une con el derecho a la participación. Y estas comunidades de ese sitio tan maravilloso que tiene nuestro país tuvieron que enfrentarse a través de un litigio estratégico muy fuerte, inclusive con las mismas instituciones del Estado, para poder garantizar que pudieran hacer este trabajo. Aquí entonces encontramos un recurso legal muy importante, lo que nosotros podríamos llamar la justicia ambiental en todo su esplendor a través de el trabajo que hacen las mismas colectividades. Hay algo muy importante y es que la justicia ambiental no solamente tiene que ver con las decisiones de los jueces, también tiene que ver con las decisiones administrativas. Ya lo decíamos nosotros que cuando se toma una decisión como hacer una evaluación ambiental para un proyecto que requiere, por supuesto, una licencia ambiental, en este caso las comunidades deben conocer de esos proyectos. Tenemos un río que iba a ser desviado precisamente para hacer una construcción de una hidroeléctrica y las comunidades se unieron ¿para qué? Para pedir el acceso a la información, porque no tenían información sobre el proyecto, pero no solamente el acceso a la información de que podría hacerse el proyecto, sino de cómo podrían verse afectados por el proyecto. El caso del río La Miel es un caso representativo de lo que puede hacer el acceso a la justicia ambiental desde el orden de la administración, desde procesos administrativos, no desde procesos judiciales. Y aquí en este sentido, entonces, nosotros podríamos decir, se une la comunidad, comunidades aledañas que se iban a ver afectadas porque el agua que se iba a llevar a la represa, por supuesto, los dejaba sin agua a una comunidad. Y lograron que se hiciese una distribución justa y equitativa del agua para poder llegar a hacer el proyecto que hoy se constituye en uno de los proyectos hidroeléctricos que ofrece energía a una región muy importante de Colombia. Entonces, quiero resaltar que la justicia ambiental no solamente tiene que ver con procesos judiciales, sino también con procesos administrativos alrededor de temas como este. Y quiero resaltar en este sentido algo muy importante que ha sucedido recientemente. Hace pocos días salió en nuestro país una nueva sentencia que habla de algo fundamental y es el desplazamiento que se dan de comunidades por temas de cambio climático. Miren ustedes, Colombia es un país rico en agua, rico en lluvias, rico en temporadas de calor que está sufriendo de manera desproporcionada el tema del cambio, de las afectaciones por cambio climático. Y en este caso específico, la Corte Constitucional acaba de sacar una sentencia donde no habla de justicia climática, pero sí habla de justicia ambiental. Y en esta sentencia específicamente defiende los derechos de unos campesinos que querían ser atendidos por la unidad de víctimas como consecuencia del cambio climático. Nosotros tenemos una unidad de víctimas por el tema del conflicto armado y nunca se había abordado el tema de el desplazamiento por temas climáticos. La Corte Constitucional acaba de hacerlo de una manera muy importante para resaltar. ¿Por qué razón? Porque comenzamos a ver cómo el litigio estratégico en materia de cambio climático se está dando en el país y en el mundo. Muestra de ello es una sentencia sobre el caso de la Amazonía, que fue una demanda que fue presentada por jóvenes niños con el apoyo de una gran ONG colombiana para que se declarara la Amazonía como un territorio sujeto de derechos. Y miren ustedes qué importante señalar que este litigio está haciendo que se enfrente hoy en día el tema del cambio climático como una estrategia especial para la protección de estas comunidades. En ese sentido, adicionalmente, tenemos que ver que la Corte Constitucional y los jueces de nuestro país vienen avanzando de manera muy importante hacia nuevas figuras del derecho, nuevos paradigmas del derecho, y esos nuevos paradigmas están referidos a entender que no solamente las personas naturales y las personas jurídicas tienen derechos, sino que también otros sujetos tienen derechos, como los ríos o en este caso la Amazonía. Y adicionalmente a eso debo señalar algo muy importante, y es que esta sentencia habla de manera muy importante de crear el tema de víctimas la figura especial de los desplazados ambientales. Aquí entonces encontramos algo muy importante que se señalaba hoy en el marco de esta discusión, y es el tema de la responsabilidad común pero diferenciada. Pero ¿qué hacemos para que las comunidades que se ven afectadas, que no tienen participación, que no tienen información, que adicionalmente sus territorios son deteriorados, sean sujetos de indemnizaciones, ¿sí? Aquí tenemos una gran dificultad y es que la reparación a estas comunidades no llegan. Y como no llegan a la reparación, podríamos hablar que sufren de una doble discriminación, de una doble afectación a la justicia ambiental. Una, por no haber sido desafortunadamente atendidos sus derechos, como el derecho a gozar de un ambiente sano, pero dos, adicionalmente por no ser reparados por los daños que se generan a estas comunidades. Entonces aquí es muy importante mirar el tema de la responsabilidad alrededor de estos temas. Y en especial, cuando son realizados o generados por empresas transnacionales. ¿A quién acuden las comunidades? ¿A qué país acuden para reclamar la justicia ambiental? Esas son las preguntas que debemos hacernos y que, por supuesto, tienen que ver con la justicia, la participación y la reparación en materia ambiental. Por último, debo señalar que el tema del acceso a la información es un derecho también muy importante para las comunidades. Y aquí encontramos algo fundamental, y es que Colombia cuenta con un sistema de información ambiental en nuestro país, un sistema que está funcionando, pero un sistema al cual le hace falta una parte, y es la información que suministran las comunidades alrededor de sus territorios. Nadie conoce más los territorios y la biodiversidad que existe en sus territorios que las mismas colectividades. Por esa razón, por ejemplo, la Red Nacional la Red de Reservas Naturales de la Sociedad Civil en Colombia, que son personas que tienen propiedad privada, que se dedican a tareas de conservación, han comenzado a trabajar muchísimo para proporcionar información a las empresas, por ejemplo, que van a hacer proyectos y al Estado. Aquí tenemos la necesidad entonces de poder avanzar en ¿qué? Avanzar en la información para que esa información tenga elementos académicos, interdisciplinarios de las comunidades, de los sabedores, de quienes conocen los territorios. Y este ejemplo de ResNatur puede servirnos mucho para ver cómo se está haciendo la participación y la información en nuestro país. Y finalmente,
Sorry.
algo muy importante.
Sorry, madam, may I invite you to reach the conclusion of your presentation? Thank you.
Colombia tiene pendiente aprobar el acuerdo de Escazú. No ha sido fácil. Hemos tenido mucha oposición alrededor de garantizar la participación, el acceso a la información y sobre todo un elemento que nos trae el acuerdo de Escazú, y es la defensa de aquellas personas que se dedican a la protección ambiental, los defensores de derechos humanos en materia ambiental. Desafortunadamente no ha sido tan sencillo. En este momento tenemos un proceso donde hay múltiples aristas sobre eso y donde vemos la necesidad de que el acuerdo de Escazú sirva para garantizar la participación, para garantizar el acceso a la información, para garantizar, por supuesto, la justicia ambiental y, por último, para que Colombia, que es el segundo país del mundo donde más se asesinan defensores ambientales, pueda tomar medidas concretas alrededor de eso. La justicia ambiental y social encuentra en el acuerdo de Escazú una oportunidad en avanzar en la defensa de los derechos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much for these very impressive examples of advancement in the, decisions taken to protect the environment, protect the people from environmental damages. Now I would like to give the floor to Anna Hira. You're part, as I explained, of the OECD Youth Advisory Board, and you're a young Maori woman, and you're also working for the Ministry of Environment in New Zealand. So what you think should be done to amplify the voices of the young people in environmental policy? And it's a little bit of follow-up of the previous Austrian question. And more specifically, what are some of the examples of meaningful engagement of indigenous peoples in policymaking in New Zealand?
Thank you. Well, hard acts to follow, right? I'll start this in Te Reo Māori, the native language of the Māori people in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Oh, I'll get my clicker too. Thank you. Ka tangi te titi, ka tangi te kaka, ka tangi hoki ahau. Tihei mauri ora. E ngā manu o ngā wātapo te motu, tēnā koutou. Ko Ranginui e tū iho nei, ko Papatūānuku e tākoto nei tēnā kōrua. Ki te awa Sen me te maunga Montmat, ki tērā tēnā kōrua. Nō reira, he whakatauki mai i Aotearoa tēnei, toi tū te marae a tāne mahuta, toi tū te marae a Tangaroa, toi tū te tangata. Ko Mauao te me Tararua o ku maunga, ko Tauranga me Raukawa o ku moana, ko Waitao me Parirua o ku awa, he ria hau no Tainui mā tātua me Tākitimu, ko Anihira tōku ingoa. Kia ora everyone, my name is Anihira Nin and I'm honoured to be here to speak with you all and to be on a panel with these two powerhouses, as well as getting an opportunity to close out the day. I wear a number of hats, including as a YouthWise member, which is the Youth Advisory Board for the OECD, and as a public servant leading Indigenous climate policy for the Ministry for the Environment in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I am here in my capacity as a YouthWise member and will be providing you with my perspectives and lived experiences as a young Indigenous Māori woman who works for the New Zealand government and continues to participate in tribal matters to ensure my people's rights and interests are protected. Now, I started my talk with a traditional acknowledgement in the language of my ancestors to connect me to my land and people, as well as to all of you. I am Māori. The Māori people are Indigenous to Aotearoa, which is the indigenous name for New Zealand, and they belong to different tribes and therefore different landscapes across Aotearoa, New Zealand. For further identification, in case some of you are like, who's that still? The haka comes from Māori culture, which is the fierce dance the All Blacks do prior to beating France and England soundly at rugby. Now, we see Papatūānuku, or Mother Earth, as a living being and our landmarks as ancestors. The granting of legal personhood to the Urewera forests, Wanganui River, and most recently Taranaki Mountain in Aotearoa demonstrates this. We see our people as part of the circular holistic ecosystem where our actions will have an impact intergenerationally. So understanding who we are and our connection to the world around us informs how we might engage with it and take part in it. Now, you'll see in this picture here is my koro, my grandfather, Buck Nin, who was a contemporary Māori artist. His work was drawn from Māori carving, weaving and traditional meeting house patterns, and often depicted Mother Earth as a living, breathing being. Ko tōna mahi toi, ko te whenua, ko tōna mahi toi. His art was the land and the land was his art. The motifs included in this presentation are his works to reiterate to you all the importance of the Indigenous and intergenerational lens to the environmental justice conversation. Now, I'm also a young person. In my culture, we call young people rangatahi. Ranga means to raise up, to pull up by the roots, and tahi refers to the number one, and often in words and Māori words, as one together. So put together, ranga and tahi are our young ones who are still growing and are to be raised up by those around them. Our rangatahi, or our young people, are the leaders of tomorrow, and in a lot of cases, today, which is why it is important for us to ensure rangatahi have equitable access and being engaged on key matters that impact their futures. So my take on this particular topic is focused on how to enable and empower people like me to be engaged, involved, and in the context of our young people, preparing them to be the policy and decision makers of tomorrow and today. Now, there are 5 key learnings I'd like to share with you today from my context and perspective that I believe progress enabling equitable access for frontline communities in the environmental justice conversation. Key learning number 1, get frontline communities in these spaces. Enabling people who represent certain frontline communities to be in these spaces is crucial to increasing access for them. And I don't just mean these conference spaces, I mean policy and process development, decision-making, all of it. They understand the context that they exist in, and while it shouldn't be on them to advocate solely for their communities in these spaces, policymakers need those perspectives to enable the development of fit-for-purpose solutions to increasing access for these communities. An example of this in Aotearoa, New Zealand, has been the creation of a youth advisory group this year, pictured here, for the Ministry for the Environment, to provide perspectives and advice on climate policy in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and more specifically, the development of our second emissions reduction plan under our Climate Change Response Act. The way that New Zealand government develops policy also requires us to consider the Treaty of Waitangi, or Te Tiriti o Waitangi, impacts. The Treaty of Waitangi is Aotearoa New Zealand's constitutional document and provides a framework for the government to consider Māori rights and interests to reflect more equitable outcomes for Māori communities. There are also pieces of legislation that include treaty clauses. The Resource Management Act is such a law and is New Zealand's primary natural resource allocation and decision-making law. It includes provisions to protect environmental assets that Māori value and a number of procedural provisions requiring consideration of tikanga Māori, which is traditional Māori law, and consultation with Māori in decision-making processes. However, huge challenges to Māori tribes being meaningfully engaged to these processes require resource and funding, time, and capacity. So in practice, this participation varies throughout the country, from the likes of well-resourced tribes who have whole teams and partnerships to dedicate time into these processes, to small tribes with single tribal members who take time from their day job, some unpaid, to be involved in these processes. So how might you ensure further equitable access for these communities? Key learning number 2, invest in relationships with these frontline communities. Building relationships with frontline communities require investment, time, money, people, and authentic effort. But the benefit of building relationships with these communities can result in ensuring equitable engagement and subsequently better outcomes for those communities at place. I've been lucky enough to have worked at the local and regional level for tribes in Aotearoa. This includes having worked for my own tribe, Ngāti Toa Rangatira, which has rights and interests over the bottom of the North Island and the top of the South Island, including our capital city, Wellington. This tribe holds relationships with local and central government authorities that have required investment on both sides. It has resulted in unique working partnerships that enable Ngāti Toa Rangatira to further exercise kaitiakitanga, or the concept of guardianship, over their lands and waters, resulting in better outcomes for all communities. An example of this in practice has been the inclusion of tribal representatives on decision-making for our respective on decision-making communities at the local authority level. So I represented Ngāti Toa on the long-term planning committee for Greater Wellington Regional Council, a local authority, along with 5 other tribal representatives, each of us representing the 6 tribal partners Greater Wellington Council has. The inclusion of these tribal representatives ensured greater representation, voice, and decision-making for our respective peoples, lands, and waters. So what does building these relationships with frontline communities actually look like? Key learning number 3. Translate and contextualize the jargon, please. Enabling access to information also requires breaking down that information and translating it for your audience to understand in their own context. I literally had to do that for the topic of this session when explaining my talk to everyone at home I spoke to. The sentence, how to engage with people like me, was the outcome. We're seeing more politically engaged young people now more than ever, given the access provided to them via social media and new technology. They see people like themselves breaking down the jargon, contextualizing it to what it means for them. An example of this being done with a series of youth consultations on the OECD youth recommendation that Youthwise helped to facilitate, where young people were invited to explore areas of policy affecting them. It is so important for policymakers to figure out ways we can do this when engaging with these communities. It ties really well with key learning number 1. Getting frontline communities into these spaces, as now I, as a public servant, can utilize my skills and knowledge of my communities to enable and assist with ensuring our engagement translates and contextualizes the jargon. So, put simply, keep it simple. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, there are several pieces of context relevant to the next key learning. Research has shown that our Māori and Pacifica populations have been and continue being disproportionately impacted by adverse environmental factors and natural hazards. The wider Asia-Pacific area is particularly vulnerable due to its geography, with whole countries in the Pacific already planning for their displacement. Despite being disproportionately impacted, Māori and Pacifica communities are leading the response to climate impacts across Aotearoa and the wider Pacific, leading and mobilising communities to respond to emergency events, and more recently, the Cyclone Gabriel that hit Aotearoa, New Zealand in early 2023. Māori communities in particular were able to mobilise quickly and led responses in their communities to help with the response and subsequent recovery. We saw young people engaging with the efforts through social media, promoting it in their own way and helping to raise awareness of what their friends and relatives were going through. It was an incredible example of what can happen if we just get out of the way and resource communities to make informed decisions and actions. So this brings us to our key learning number 4, get out of the way. I don't mean leave communities to their own devices. However, it's important to note that our frontline communities are highly capable. Ask them what they need. Usually it's resource, and then do what you can to set the necessary parameters while enabling as much access as possible for these communities to accurate information, participation, and decision-making for them at place. Now, for Māori communities, this is called tino rangatiratanga, having the ability to make decisions about their treasures, including their lands, waters, and people. So how can Māori communities express their tino rangatiratanga? And more broadly, how can frontline communities self-determine their futures? My cousin and I developed and led a climate wānanga, or a discussion, over 3 days for rangatahi descended from 3 tribes in our region who are closely tied to each other. This wānanga and discussion was all about ideating our aspirations for our lands, seas, and people as we become the leaders of tomorrow. This resulted in the mural that you see in front of you, the aspirations of the young people of our 3 iwi, Atiawa, Raukawa, and Toa Rangatira. This example demonstrates several things. Frontline communities know what they want for themselves. They understand what tino rangatiratanga looks like to them. They just need to be resourced to do it. Number 2, environmental justice doesn't just focus on environmental outcomes, but social, health, and economic as well, and for everyone. Which brings us to our final point. What's good for Māori is good for everyone. More broadly, what's good for frontline communities is also good for everyone. There doesn't have to be a trade-off when providing access for frontline communities to information, participation, and legal recourse. It can be an and conversation. You just have to look at our vision, our aspirations board developed by our young people to know that this is true. We want our lands and waters to be healthy, to help everyone be healthy. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's easy, that once you have these 5 things down, you'll be sweet. In fact, it'll probably make things even more challenging. While I've outlined some examples of how Aotearoa New Zealand attempts to mitigate barriers to young and Indigenous access to these environmental processes, as South Africa put it, we still have our challenges. This includes a potential incoming bill that aims to replace and repeal treaty clauses from legislation, which will likely decrease access for Māori to participate in environmental processes that impact them disproportionately. Instead, the 5 key learnings are intended to progress policymakers on their journey to ensuring equitable access for frontline communities, including young and Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have continued to advocate for the environment since way before it was called care, and young people are truly our bridge to the future. So why not develop fit-for-purpose processes to enable them equitable access? In closing, I'll leave you with this parting message. Toi tū te whenua, toi tū ngā iwi, toi tū ngā rangatahi, toi tū te tiriti. Nō reira, huri noi tō tātou whare, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you, Anahira, and thank you to all of you. These were passionate presentations. I'm not sure we have a time for proper Q&A. What I would suggest is that if you have questions to the 3 presenters, we have the cocktail. So you'll be still busy during the cocktail. I apologize, but thank you so much for really putting the light on different aspects of procedural environmental justice, that very passionate one, the defense of the activists, the progress in Colombia, and how you are making sure that your law is progressively advancing, and this vision on how to engage with indigenous communities, and the examples and the good lessons or experience that you are sharing with us. Thank you very much again. So you are all invited now to go to the cocktail. First, I should tell you that tomorrow we begin again at 9. But you could arrive in advance. There will be something as a breakfast, a light breakfast, so that you avoid the line, the security. And now the cocktail will be in the garden of the chateau if it's not raining. I don't know.
It is raining.
It is raining. Okay, so it's in the atrium. That means up. You go at the end of the corridor on the right.
Take the escalator.
Take the escalator, and it should be there.
Who should they follow?
Well, follow Joe. Thank you again. Yeah.